16th century. Within the Andean highland fortress of Cajamarca, the Spanish conquistadors oversaw the assembly of a ransom that remains the largest singular transfer of wealth in human history. To secure the release of the Sapa Inca Atahualpa, a room measuring approximately 22 feet by 17 feet was filled with roughly 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver. These were funneled into this single chamber, representing a concentrated injection of liquidity that would shortly destabilize every major European market. At modern valuation, adjusting for the purchasing power of precious metals and their subsequent impact on global trade, this hoard equates to an estimated $15 trillion. This capital did not simply vanish into Spanish coffers, but it acted as the ultimate collateral for a web of high-interest loans held by a shadow network of European creditors. While the physical bullion was being guarded by Pizarro's infantry, its value was already being traded on the bourses of Antwerp and through the merchant houses of Seville. The sheer volume of this metal ended the era of medieval scarcity, triggering the price revolution and fueling the transition to a globalized, credit-based economy. The ransom was the proof of concept for the most lucrative private equity venture of the 16th century, transforming a speculative military gamble into a guaranteed sovereign payout that serviced the debts of a bankrupt Spanish crown and its invisible financiers. While the physical brutality of the 1530s conquest is often attributed to the martial ambition of the Pizarro brothers, but the structural reality of the campaign was that of a leveraged commercial enterprise. Francisco Pizarro, an illiterate mercenary, lacked the personal liquidity required to outfit a transoceanic expedition. The necessary capital required for the procurement of naval vessels, the casting of artillery, and the high-interest provisioning of infantry was supplied by a sophisticated syndicate of Converso financiers. These new Christians, often only a generation removed from the 1492 expulsion, operated as a clandestine merchant class that converted the trauma of exile into a competitive advantage, a borderless financial network that bypassed the traditional rigidities of the Spanish feudal system. These financiers did not view Peru as a religious mission or a territorial expansion of the crown, but as a high-risk, a high-reward investment vehicle. They utilized the Compañía structure, a legal precursor to the joint stock company, where capital was pooled from silent partners across the Sephardic diaspora. By the time Pizarro reached the Incan border, his expedition was already technically owned by creditors in Seville and Antwerp. These investors provided the essential technical expertise, from cartographic intelligence to the logistical management of the silver trade, transforming a chaotic invasion into an organized asset seizure. For the Converso elite, the conquest offered a rare opportunity to embed themselves into the core of the Spanish imperial economy, using the massive influx of New World bullion to settle old debts and secure a foothold in a kingdom that had officially rejected them. The invisible hand of the conquest was not a market force, but a ledger of accounts. But it all started way before it. The Edict of Expulsion, signed by Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon in March 1492, mandated the total removal of the Jewish population from Spanish territories within 4 months. This administrative decree forced approximately 200,000 people to make a choice between forced conversion or permanent exile. Because the crown prohibited the export of minted gold or silver coinage, the Sephardic community was compelled to liquidate centuries of landed property and fixed assets at a massive loss. In response, they utilized their unique position within the Mediterranean and European commercial circuits to transform their wealth into intangible and highly mobile financial instruments. The primary vehicle for this transfer was the letter of credit, a sophisticated paper instrument that allowed refugees to deposit assets with trusted agents in Spain and draw the equivalent value in foreign ports like Lisbon, Naples, or Istanbul. Beyond paper wealth, the community carried a monopoly on specific forms of intellectual capital: advanced astronomical tables for navigation, metallurgical secrets for refining precious ores, and a multilingual diplomatic network that spanned from the Ottoman Empire to the Low Countries. By 1500, this diaspora had established a shadow treasury outside the reach of the Inquisition. These portable assets were not merely for survival. They formed the seed capital for a new type of global merchant banking system. When the Spanish crown eventually needed to finance the massive overhead of the New World expansion, they found themselves paradoxically dependent on the very capital and intelligence networks they had officially cast out. The wealth of 1492 did not disappear. It became the fuel for the next century of imperial conquest. By 1497, the Sephardic financial elite had strategically relocated to Lisbon, transforming the Portuguese capital into a critical clearinghouse for the Iberian economy. Unlike Spain's aggressive internal focus on religious uniformity, the Portuguese crown, led by Manuel I, initially prioritized the retention of Jewish capital and technical expertise to fund its maritime expansion into the Indian Ocean. This created a unique geopolitical window where the Converso merchant class could operate with relative autonomy, while establishing what historians recognize as a shadow bridge. This bridge was a sophisticated cross-border network that allowed for the continuous flow of capital and credit between the officially separated markets of Portugal and Spain. The Portuguese pivot was not merely a flight to safety, it was a move to secure the choke points of global trade. From Lisbon, Converso bankers controlled the distribution of spices and African gold, which they used as high-grade collateral to issue loans to the Spanish Habsburgs. By 1500, they had perfected the triangular trade of credit, where Peruvian and Mexican silver, once it began to flow, could be pre-sold in Antwerp to pay for Portuguese imports, all managed through family-run merchant houses in Lisbon. This system allowed the Converso elite to remain indispensable to the Spanish treasury, while physically residing outside the reach of the Castilian Inquisition. This financial infrastructure ensured that even as Spain sought to purge its Jewish population, it remained entirely dependent on their shadow banking system to maintain the liquidity of its global empire. The Portuguese refugee served as the operational headquarters for the financing of the American conquest, turning the Atlantic into a private Converso highway. The institutionalization of the new Christian identity following the mass-forced conversions of 1497 created a unique sociological shell for the Sephardic financial elite. While the Spanish and Portuguese crowns viewed the Converso class as a religious project for assimilation, the families themselves operated as a highly disciplined, trans-generational venture capital firm. The Converso mask was not merely a survival tactic, it was a sophisticated legal and commercial strategy that allowed these families to maintain insider status within the Iberian economy while functioning as an independent, transnational network. This demographic possessed a unique dual legitimacy. They held the legal rights of Spanish subjects to participate in colonial trade, yet they retained the lateral trust and private accounting practices of the Jewish diaspora. Driven by the existential need for a secure sanctuary beyond the reach of the Holy Office, the Converso elite prioritized the accumulation of liquid capital over land-based wealth. This focus on liquidity enabled them to react instantaneously to shifts in the imperial landscape. They developed a rigorous internal vetting system for business partners based on kinship and proven reliability, effectively creating a closed-loop economy where information and capital circulated with zero friction. While they outwardly adhered to Catholic rites, their financial operations were fueled by the imperative to build an offshore base of power. By 1530, this group had effectively monopolized the administrative and financial layers of the Spanish merchant marine. They were not merely participants in the conquest, they were the architects of its fiscal sustainability, on leveraging their new Christian status to secure the royal contracts and mining permits that would soon yield the silver required to fund their eventual migration to safer financial hubs in the north. The institutional expansion into the New World was driven by a fundamental shift in risk management, the search for geographical insulation from the Madrid-based Inquisition. By 1530, the Holy Office had tightened its grip on the Iberian Peninsula, creating a stifling environment for Converso families whose assets were subject to arbitrary seizure upon any accusation of Judaizing. The Americas offered a critical administrative lag. The vast physical distance across the Atlantic meant that royal decrees and inquisitorial mandates often took months or even years to be enforced in the peripheries of the empire. This frontier autonomy provided the necessary breathing room for the Converso financial elite to operate their clandestine commercial networks with significantly lower levels of domestic surveillance. The selection of the Viceroyalty of Peru as a primary destination was a calculated move to exploit the lack of established institutional oversight. In the early decades of the Conquest, the colonial bureaucracy was porous and heavily dependent on private funding to maintain order. Converso financiers leveraged this dependency, trading their capital for high-level administrative posts that granted them immunity and control over local legal records. This was not a flight toward religious freedom in the modern sense, but a strategic relocation to a low-regulation zone where their capital could be deployed without the immediate threat of confiscation. By embedding themselves in the furthest reaches of the Spanish world, these families created a buffer zone between their wealth and the centralizing power of the Spanish crown, effectively using the geography of the Andes as a protective vault for their global financial interests. The escalating fiscal demands of the Habsburg imperial project created an intractable tension between the ideological mandates of the Holy Office and the pragmatic requirements of the Spanish treasury. By the mid-1530s, Charles V was embroiled in a multi-front conflict involving the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Turks, and the Protestant Reformation in Germany. These military commitments required an immediate and massive supply of liquid capital that the traditional Spanish nobility, whose wealth was locked in landed estates, could not provide. The crown was forced into a deal with the devil, establishing a symbiotic dependency on the Converso financial elite who possessed the necessary international credit lines. This arrangement effectively transformed the Inquisition into a secondary concern for the central government when weighed against the bottom line. While the Holy Office continued its persecutions, the Crown frequently intervened to grant special dispensations, or indultos, to high-value Converso financiers. In exchange for massive upfront loans, often structured as asientos or short-term high-interest contracts, entire merchant families were granted temporary immunity from inquisitorial investigation. This created a paradoxical state of affairs where the Spanish government was essentially selling safety to the very group its official doctrine condemned. This fiscal pragmatism allowed the Jewish-descended elite to become the primary underwriters of the Spanish infantry's expansion into Peru. By leveraging the king's desperate need for gold to pay his European mercenaries, the financiers secured a degree of political leverage that ensured their operations in the New World remained profitable and protected, turning the Crown's bankruptcy into their ultimate defensive shield. By 1535, the Isthmus of Panama had been transformed into the primary logistical node and dark pool for the financing of the Incan conquest. Despite its lethal climate and high mortality rates, the city of Panama functioned as the 16th century equivalent of an unregulated Wall Street. It served as the essential clearinghouse where the new Christian merchant houses of Seville and Lisbon concentrated their capital to bypass the formal oversight of the Spanish Casa de Contratación. In this tropical outpost, the legal and financial structures of the Peruvian expedition were finalized far from the prying eyes of the royal accountants in Madrid. The city operated as a high-velocity credit hub. Because the physical transport of gold was risky and slow, Panama specialized in the trade of futures, the sale of anticipated Incan loot that had not yet been seized. Converso financiers utilized this dark pool to provide immediate liquidity to Pizarro and his associates in exchange for massive equity stakes in the venture. These transactions were often unrecorded in official government registers, allowing the financiers to hide their true profit margins and avoid the royal fifth tax. Furthermore, Panama was the site where the Triple Alliance contract was refined, a document that treated the conquest as a corporate merger The city's notaries, many of whom had ties to the Converso network, facilitated the complex layering of debt. Here, equipment, horses, and slaves were sold at markups exceeding 500%, with payment guaranteed by future silver yields. This financial architecture ensured that before Pizarro ever saw a single Incan temple, the city of Panama had already extracted the first wave of profit from the conquest, cementing its role as the engine of colonial capital. In 1524, the formal leadership of the Peruvian enterprise was consolidated under a legal triumvirate known as the Empresa de Levante. While Francisco Pizarro provided the military command and Diego de Almagro managed the logistics of recruitment and supply, the third partner, Hernando de Luque, served a more complex function as the venture's primary financial conduit. Luque, a priest and schoolmaster based in Panama, did not possess the personal capital required to underwrite an expedition of such magnitude. Historical records and notarized agreements from the era reveal that Luque acted as a sophisticated frontman or legal shell for the Gaspar de Espinosa merchant family, prominent New Christians whose financial operations spanned the Caribbean. The Espinosa family utilized Luque to shield their massive capital injections from direct royal scrutiny and to mitigate the social risks of being the primary creditors to a high-stakes military gamble. By positioning a member of the clergy as the official investor, the syndicate gained a layer of ecclesiastical protection and administrative legitimacy that a Converso merchant house could not achieve on its own. Behind Luque's signature lay a network of hidden equity holders who provided the 20,000 pesos in gold necessary for the initial voyages. This capital was not a loan, but a structured investment that guaranteed the silent partners a proportional share of all land, labor, and precious metals seized from the Inca. This triple alliance was, in reality, a quadruple arrangement where the ultimate control over the expedition's feasibility rested with the Converso financiers, who held the purse strings while remaining invisible in the official dispatches sent to the Spanish crown. By the late 1520s, Seville had solidified its position as the bureaucratic and financial gateway to the Spanish Empire, housing the critical networks of the abonados. These were elite, Jewish-descended banking families who, despite their Converso status, acted as the primary guarantors for high-stakes colonial ventures. In the specialized financial language of the era, an abonado was a person of proven credit-worthiness, whose personal wealth served as the collateral for state-sanctioned contracts. These families utilized the asiento, a formal royal lease or debt contract, to funnel massive amounts of private capital into the Pizarro expedition. The asiento functioned as a legal bridge, allowing the financiers to bypass the slow-moving royal treasury and provide Pizarro with immediate, liquid resources for shipbuilding and armament. The civilian merchant houses operated with a level of sophistication that anticipated modern investment banking. They did not simply lend money, they underwrote the entire logistical risk of the voyage. Through their control of the Consulado de Cargadores a Indias, they managed the flow of credit between the European manufacturers of military hardware and the explorers in the field. These financiers were the architects of interest-bearing conquest, where every sword, horse, and pound of hardtack was advanced as a loan to be repaid in Incan silver, at rates often exceeding 30%. This system created a cycle of perpetual debt for the conquistadors, ensuring that the primary beneficiaries of the Peruvian conquest were not the soldiers in the Andes, but the merchant bankers in Seville, who held the paper debt of the empire. These abonados transformed the conquest into a predictable revenue stream for the Sephardic financial diaspora. By 1536, the Sephardic financial network had moved beyond simple lending into the realm of diversified risk, a precursor to modern portfolio theory. Recognizing the extreme volatility of frontier warfare, Converso merchant houses implemented a strategy of cross-funding rival factions within the Spanish command. They did not commit their entire capital reserves to Francisco Pizarro. Instead, they simultaneously underwrote the expeditions of competitors like Pedro de Alvarado and Diego de Almagro. This was not a betrayal of trust, but a sophisticated hedge. By providing the credit necessary for multiple captains to outfit ships and hire mercenaries, the financiers ensured that regardless of which commander reached the Incan core first, or which faction emerged victorious from the inevitable internal disputes, the underlying debt remained secured by the physical territory seized. This strategy transformed the conquest from a winner-take-all gamble into a guaranteed return on investment for the new Christian syndicate. The financiers utilized the Campania legal structure to create interlocking directorates, where a single family might hold a 15% stake in Pizarro's venture, while secretly financing 20% of his rival's supply chain. This ensured that the debt obligations of the losing party were often absorbed by the victor as a condition of legal settlement, a process known as debt assumption. By 1538, the creditors had effectively commodified the conflict itself. Every skirmish between Spanish factions increased the demand for high-interest loans for weaponry and medical supplies, turning the internal instability of the conquest into a secondary profit center. For the bankers in Seville and Panama, the primary objective was not the victory of a specific man, but the uninterrupted servicing of the aggregate debt. The Campania of the 1530s was the administrative engine of the Peruvian conquest, functioning as a sophisticated precursor to the modern private equity firm. Unlike the state-funded expeditions of the later colonial era, the initial incursions into Incan territory were structured as strictly private, joint stock ventures. Under this legal framework, the new Christian financiers in Panama and Seville acted as limited partners, providing the essential dry powder, liquid capital, while Pizarro and Almagro served as general partners responsible for the physical execution of the asset seizure. This corporate structure allowed for the pooling of capital from diverse sources, while insulating the primary investors from the legal liabilities of military failure. Each expedition was governed by a formal, notarized contract that treated the conquest as a commercial merger. Shares, or partes, were issued based on the level of capital contribution. A horseman who provided his own mount and armor received a larger equity stake than a foot soldier, but the largest supervoting shares were held by the silent Converso backers who financed the high overhead costs of ships and artillery. The Campania model also introduced the concept of carried interest, where the leadership took a percentage of the profits only after the initial investors had been repaid their principal plus interest. This financial architecture transformed the chaotic violence of the Andes into a predictable tiered payout system. By the time the ransom of Atahualpa reached the coast, the Campania had already established a seniority of claims, ensuring that the new Christian syndicate extracted their dividends before a single gold bar was distributed to the rank-and-file infantry. By the 1530s, the physical movement of precious metals had become a secondary and often avoided method of settling accounts within the Sephardic financial network. To mitigate the extreme risks of Atlantic piracy and the administrative delays of the Spanish fleet system, Converso bankers utilized the letra de cambio, or letter of exchange. This instrument functioned as a sophisticated 16th-century wire transfer, allowing for the instantaneous movement of value across the Portuguese pivot without the transit of a single gold coin. A financier in Lisbon could issue a letter against a credit line in Antwerp, which was then used to purchase German-made artillery or Italian textiles, with the final debt being settled in Panama, using the anticipated yields of the Incan conquest. The efficacy of this system relied on a private, decentralized clearinghouse of trust. Because these merchant families operated through a trans-generational diaspora, a new Christian agent in Seville knew that a signature from a kinsman in Bruges was as reliable as bullion. This paper trail created a closed-loop liquidity system that was invisible to the Spanish crown's tax collectors. By the time the Casa de Contratación in Seville could audit a ship's manifest, the value of its cargo had often been traded 4 times over through speculative exchange in Northern Europe. These letters allowed the Converso elite to decouple wealth from geography. They could fund a massacre in the Andes from a counting house in Flanders, ensuring that capital remained mobile liquid, and, most importantly, beyond the reach of the Inquisition's confiscatory powers. This financial architecture transformed the Conquest into a series of abstract, profitable entries on a global ledger. By 1531, the recruitment of the Spanish rank-and-file for the Peruvian expedition was executed through an aggressive credit-based labor model. Francisco Pizarro did not pay wages to his soldiers. Instead, he functioned as a secondary lender, issuing gear and provisions as high-interest advances against future plunder. This system turned the average infantryman into a debtor before the campaign even reached the Andean coast. Every essential item, from a 50 peso arquebus to a 2,000 peso war horse, was sold to the troops at localized prices that reflected 300% to 500% markups over Seville market rates. The new Christian financiers in Panama acted as the ultimate sources of this credit, providing the hardware that Pizarro then distributed to his men. This created a tiered structure of debt. The soldiers owed the captains, and the captains owed the merchant houses. To ensure repayment, while the expeditionary contracts mandated that all personal debts be settled directly from the first cut of the loot, effectively placing the creditor's claims ahead of the soldier's survival needs. If a soldier died in battle, his debt was not forgiven. It was transferred to his heirs, or deducted from the collective shares of his unit. This financial arrangement effectively weaponized the poverty of the Spanish peasantry, forcing them to fight with extreme brutality to clear their personal balance sheets. By the time of the Atahualpa ransom, the vast majority of the conquerors discovered that their share of the gold was already entirely spoken for by the interest accrued on their initial equipment loans. The real winners were the silent partners who collected the principal without ever drawing a sword. By 1535, the Converso merchant elite had mastered the use of maritime insurance as a sophisticated tool for capital flight and regulatory evasion. While the Spanish Casa de Contratación enforced a strict monopoly on Atlantic trade, necessitating that all cargo be registered and taxed in Seville, the new Christian syndicate utilized the barratry and total loss loophole to bypass these constraints. Financiers would overinsure aging vessels through complex syndicates in Antwerp or Genoa, then orchestrate the accidental loss of the ship in the Caribbean or off the coast of Africa. This allowed for the immediate liquidation of physical assets into tax-free insurance payouts, effectively laundering colonial profits into clean European capital. This system served a dual purpose. It functioned as a covert mechanism for repatriating wealth beyond the reach of the Inquisition and provided a legal pretext for missing bullion shipments that were actually being diverted to Portuguese or Dutch intermediaries. Because the insurance contracts were private agreements held outside Spanish jurisdiction, the true value of the cargo remained obscured from royal accountants. These shipping magnates also utilized bottomry loans, where the ship itself served as collateral, to secure immediate cash for the Peruvian front. If the ship was lost, the debt was legally extinguished, allowing the financiers to fail strategically while retaining the actual silver through clandestine offloading at non-Spanish ports. By 1538, this maritime architecture ensured that the Converso elite remained the most liquid players in the empire, possessing the unique ability to turn a shipwreck into a profitable accounting entry that the crown could neither track nor tax. In January 1531, the departure of the Third Peruvian expedition from Panama marked the transition of the Conquest from a speculative feasibility study into a high-stakes deployment of venture capital on the ground. Francisco Pizarro led a force of exactly 168 men, supported by 3 vessels and 27 horses, a tiny contingent by military standards, but a heavily capitalized one. This expedition was not an army in the traditional sense. It was a mobile asset seizure unit whose overhead had been meticulously calculated by the Converso merchant houses. Every soldier represented a specific unit of investment, equipped with the most advanced hardware available in the Atlantic world, including 13 arquebuses and a small battery of artillery. The 168 men served as the physical agents of a much larger, invisible boardroom of shareholders. Because the venture was structured as a private compañía, the primary objective was not territorial governance, but the immediate identification and extraction of high-value liquid assets to satisfy the interest rates of the Panama dark pool. The military strategy was dictated by the fiscal requirement for a swift exit, a decisive capture of Incan leadership that would trigger a massive payout. This small force leveraged a technological and psychological asymmetry funded by the Sephardic diaspora to dismantle an empire of millions. For the silent partners in Seville and Lisbon, these 168 men were the operational front end of a global financial machine, tasked with converting Andean sovereignty into a tangible, divisible dividend that had been pre-sold on the European exchanges years before the first ship even touched the Peruvian coast. The strategic advantage of the Spanish expedition in the 1530s was significantly augmented by a superior global intelligence network anchored in the Sephardic communities of North Africa and the Levant. While the Spanish crown often relied on traditional Mediterranean portolan charts, the Converso financial elite possessed access to the more advanced cartographic data of the Ottoman and Arab worlds. Jewish cartographers and astronomers, many of whom had been instrumental in the Majorcan school of cartography, provided the precise mathematical tables and astrolabes necessary for calculating longitudinal position during the grueling Pacific transit. This was not mere academic knowledge. It was the proprietary data of a merchant class that had navigated the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean for centuries. These networks provided Pizarro with more than just maps. They offered critical geopolitical intelligence regarding the movements of global bullion. Through family ties in the Maghreb and Egypt, Converso financiers tracked the flow of gold from sub-Saharan Africa, allowing them to predict the impact of Incan silver on the world market long before the metal reached Seville. This intelligence included the dissemination of secret Portuguese routes and refined compass technology that had been perfected by Jewish scientists like Abraham Zacuto. By supplying the expedition with the most accurate navigational tools of the 16th century, the Sephardic diaspora ensured that their venture capital reached its target with surgical precision. This intellectual monopoly on space and time allowed the small Spanish force to navigate the complex Peruvian coastline and coordinate maritime supply lines with a reliability that was fundamentally impossible for the Incan Empire to counter. The military outcome of 1538 was fundamentally determined by a technological and logistical superiority rooted in the Sephardic-controlled iron trade of Europe. While the Inca possessed superior numbers, the Spanish weaponry was forged from Toledo steel, widely considered the most advanced metallurgical product of the 16th century. The production of these blades was not a localized Spanish craft, but a globalized industry reliant on the new Christian merchant houses that managed the extraction and distribution of high-quality iron ore from the Basque regions and Sweden. These financiers controlled the specialized kilns and the supply of carbon required for the carburization process, ensuring that Pizarro's infantry carried weapons that could bypass Incan bronze and quilted armor with ease. Furthermore, the military effectiveness of the Spanish arquebus and artillery was sustained by a consistent supply of saltpeter and sulfur, chemicals often traded through Converso networks in the Mediterranean. These materials were expensive and required precise logistical timing to arrive in the Andes before the humidity of the rainforest rendered them inert. This hardware was reinforced by the biological factor of germs, old-world diseases that preceded the Spanish advance. This biological warfare was an unintended consequence of the same global trade routes that the Sephardic diaspora had established. The high-velocity movement of people and goods across the Atlantic ensured that pathogens like smallpox arrived in the Andes ahead of the steel. This combination created a compounded debt for the Inca. They faced a military force with equipment they could not manufacture and a plague they could not cure, both delivered by a financial engine that valued efficiency over sovereignty. In November 1532, the geopolitical maneuver known as the Cajamarca Trap transformed the Peruvian expedition from a high-cost overhead venture into a liquid profit center. the ambush of the Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, and was a tactical execution of the capture the king strategy, a military model previously refined in the Caribbean, but applied here with unprecedented scale. By utilizing the psychological asymmetry of cavalry and the focused firepower of falconets, the 168-man venture capital unit successfully incapacitated the central administrative node of the Incan Empire in less than an hour. This was the precise moment the investment of the Sephardic merchant houses moved from risk to realization. The capture of Atahualpa immediately converted the intangible credit lines of the Panama dark pool into physical collateral. As the sovereign was held in a specialized stone chamber, the Spanish command issued the first formal dividend call, demanding a ransom of enough gold to fill a room once and silver twice. This ransom was not merely a trophy of war, it was a massive debt restructuring event for the Spanish crown and its creditors. The sudden influx of high-purity Andean bullion allowed the Pizarro Almagro Compañía to begin settling the predatory interest on their initial equipment loans. For the silent partners in Seville and Lisbon, Cajamarca represented the successful exit from the speculative phase of the conquest. The capture of the Inca effectively seized the empire's entire stored labor and treasury, providing the necessary liquidity to transform the Andes into a permanent, revenue-generating asset for the Converso financial diaspora. The ransom room of 1533 represented the largest single transfer of liquid wealth in human history, totaling approximately 1.3 million castellanos of gold and over 51,000 marks of silver. In physical terms, this settlement comprised roughly 6 tons of 22-karat gold and 13 tons of high-purity silver, though contemporary accounts often adjust the total weight toward 24 tons of precious metals after processing. When calculated at current market rates, the gold alone would be valued at over $450 million, but this fails to account for the imperial premium, the historical purchasing power of the bullion. Adjusting for the 16th century global economy, the ransom's value exceeds $2.5 billion modern dollars, an unprecedented return on investment for the 168 shareholders on the ground. This payout triggered an immediate metallurgical hard fork in the global economy. To facilitate the distribution, the Spanish command established a localized smelting operation that ran for 4 months, of refining intricate Incan artifacts into standardized 22-karat bars. This process was not merely an act of destruction, it was a mandatory accounting procedure to convert cultural assets into fungible currency that could be legally transferred to creditors in Seville and Antwerp. After the mandatory royal fifth tax was deducted for the crown, the remaining bullion was allocated according to the equity tiers established in the Panama Compañía contracts. This infusion of liquidity was so massive that it caused a localized devaluation of gold in the Andes, while simultaneously providing the Converso banking elite with the necessary reserves to underwrite the next phase of European industrialization. The systematic destruction of Incan material culture was not a byproduct of religious zeal, but a mandatory requirement of the global debt cycle. To the Sephardic banking syndicates in Seville and Antwerp, the intricate craftsmanship of Incan goldwork represented a non-performing asset. In the 16th century financial system, value had to be fungible and transportable to settle the asientos and letra de cambio that had funded the expedition. Consequently, the Spanish command established a smelting operation in Cajamarca that operated for 4 months, utilizing indigenous labor to run kilns at nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This process reduced centuries of Andean artistic heritage into standardized, stamped bullion bars of uniform weight and purity. This meltdown served as the ultimate audit of the Pizarro Almagro Compañía. By converting ornate statues and ceremonial plates into gold bars, the expedition leaders created a quantifiable currency that could be legally divided among the tiered ranks of the venture capital unit. More importantly, this transition allowed for the immediate repatriation of capital to the Old World. raw bullion was the only form of wealth recognized by the European bourses, a gold bar could be immediately pledged as collateral for new loans or sold on the open market in Flanders to pay for German military hardware. By 1534, this converted metal was already flowing back through the Portuguese pivot, effectively erasing the outstanding debts of the Conquest and providing the Converso elite with the liquid reserves needed to pivot from frontier exploration to the institutionalized control of global mining. The Quinto Real, or Royal Fifth, was a mandatory 20% tax on all precious metals seized in the Americas, ostensibly providing the Spanish crown with first priority status in the distribution of wealth. However, the Sephardic financial network utilized a sophisticated pre-tax deduction strategy to ensure that private capital was repatriated before the king's accountants could audit the spoils. By classifying the initial outlays for ships, horses, and weaponry as operational costs rather than profit, the Converso merchant houses successfully argued that these debts must be serviced at par before the net remainder was subject to the royal levy. This accounting maneuver effectively reduced the crown's effective tax rate to a fraction of its nominal value. Furthermore, the financiers exploited the smelting lag between the physical capture of gold and its formal assaying in the royal foundry. During this period, private IOUs were traded within the Campagna, allowing investors to swap their equity for tangible bullion that was often diverted into the black market or misclassified as base metal. To facilitate this, the Converso elite leveraged their control over the colonial notarial system, ensuring that debt certificates were backdated to precede the legal arrival of the royal tax officials. By 1535, this financial friction ensured that the crown was essentially the last stakeholder to be paid. While the king received his fifth in standardized bars, the financiers had already extracted their principal and compounded interest through a series of senior debt claims that were structurally protected from imperial seizure, turning the royal fifth into a residual rather than a primary claim. By 1540, the massive repatriation of Incan silver triggered the price revolution, a phenomenon where the sudden surge in the money supply outpaced the Spanish Empire's domestic production capacity. Unlike the Converso financiers, who had diversified their wealth into Dutch manufacturing and Genoese credit, the Spanish crown utilized the bullion primarily for non-productive military expenditures. This resulted in a threefold increase in the cost of basic commodities across Castile. The inflation bomb was not an accident but a structural consequence of a bullion-based economy that lacked a modern banking infrastructure. The disenfranchised Sephardic elite, who had been systematically excluded from land ownership, had accurately predicted that hard assets would devalue as the volume of silver grew. This economic destabilization was exacerbated by the Real Pragmatica of 1552, which attempted to fix prices, but only succeeded in fueling a thriving black market managed by the same merchant networks the state had marginalized. As the purchasing power of the Moravity plummeted, Spanish industries became uncompetitive. It was cheaper to import textiles from the Low Countries using new Christian intermediaries than to produce them in Segovia. This effectively turned Spain into a transit point for wealth rather than a generator of it. By the mid-16th century, the very silver meant to cement Spanish hegemony was instead financing the rise of northern European rivals. The bankers in Antwerp and London became the ultimate beneficiaries of Andean mining, as they absorbed the devalued silver in exchange for high-value finished goods, fulfilling the Converso prophecy that the empire would eventually starve on a mountain of gold. By 1537, the Empresa de Levante transitioned from a collaborative joint stock venture into a state of hostile litigation, culminating in the Battle of Las Salinas. The primary catalyst was not a personal feud, but a fundamental dispute over the valuation and geographic accounting of the Cusco region. Under the Capitulación de Toledo, the territory had been divided into two administrative jurisdictions, New Castile for Pizarro and New Toledo for Almagro. However, the precise longitudinal coordinates of the boundary were never verified by royal cosmographers, leading to a conflict over which partner held the equity rights to the Incan capital's remaining treasury. To the new Christian creditors, this was a failure of the original Campagna contract to define asset boundaries with sufficient legal clarity. This civil war functioned as a violent audit of the partners' respective balance sheets. Almagro, who had incurred massive debts to finance his failed expedition to Chile, required the Cusco dividend to satisfy his own syndicate of Panama-based financiers. When Pizarro's faction refused to adjust the profit-sharing ratios to account for Almagro's higher operational losses, the venture defaulted into armed conflict. The execution of Almagro in 1538 was, in financial terms, a hostile takeover that consolidated the majority shares of the Peruvian enterprise under the Pizarro family office. This internecine violence effectively wiped out the junior partners' equity, allowing the primary civilian merchant houses to restructure the debt under a single, centralized entity. By 1541, the original three partners model had been replaced by a military dictatorship, proving that without a neutral clearinghouse, the 16th century corporate structure was incapable of managing its own success. By 1538, the new Christian financiers in Panama and Seville shifted their strategy from funding discovery to underwriting civil attrition. As the Pizarro and Almagro factions descended into open warfare, the creditors recognized that a protracted conflict offered a higher internal rate of return than a swift peace. Through a process known as cross-collateralization, the same merchant houses provided high-interest credit lines to both sides of the Spanish divide. This was not a lack of loyalty, but a calculated straddle of the Peruvian market. By financing the procurement of gunpowder for the Almagristas, while simultaneously leasing transport vessels to the Pizarristas, the bankers ensured that the physical depletion of Spanish resources was consistently converted into new compounding debt. The civil wars created a premium liquidity event for the Sephardic diaspora. Because the Crown's administrative oversight was paralyzed by the fighting, the financiers could operate without the constraints of the audiencia. They implemented a double-entry lending system where the winning faction was legally obligated to assume the debts of the defeated party as a prerequisite for gaining control over the silver mines. This ensured that regardless of the military outcome at the Battle of Chupas or the assassination of Pizarro, the underlying abonado claims remained senior to any royal or colonial interest. By 1542, the financiers had effectively turned the Andes into a closed-loop debt economy. The cost of every lance and armor repair was recorded in Panama, while ensuring that the wealth of the Inca flowed through the dark pool of colonial financing to settle the accounts of a war where the creditors were the only guaranteed victors. The 1536 siege of Cusco represented a critical inflection point where the Spanish military presence in the Andes became financially over-leveraged. Led by Manco Inca, the resistance utilized a scorched earth strategy that systematically dismantled the agrarian infrastructure the Spanish relied on for interest-free provisions. This forced the trapped garrison, commanded by the Pizarro brothers, to rely almost exclusively on emergency credit lines from the Panama Dark Pool to secure reinforcements and hardware. Because the siege lasted 10 months, the daily operational costs of the Spanish defense exceeded the liquid reserves on hand, forcing the captains to sign over future mining concessions as collateral for the shipment of crossbow bolts and gunpowder from the coast. The military reality of the siege was a conflict of attrition between Incan tactical adaptation and Spanish debt sustainability. The Inca implemented hydraulic engineering to flood the plains, neutralizing the cavalry, the primary capital asset of the Spanish force. To counter this, the Pizarros were forced to buy the loyalty of diverse ethnic groups, such as the Cañari and Huanca, through promissory notes and the promise of future tax exemptions. These indigenous alliances were, in fact, complex subcontracts that added a layer of political debt to the existing financial obligations of the Compañía. By 1537, when the siege was finally broken by Almagro's returning Chilean expedition, the Spanish victory was hollow. The physical city of Cusco was a liability of ruins, and the soldiers found themselves deeper in debt to the merchant houses than they had been at the moment of Atahualpa's capture. The Battle of Las Salinas, fought on April 26, 1538, served as the final capital consolidation of the Peruvian enterprise, ending the dual sovereignty model that had paralyzed the colonial administration. Hernando Pizarro, commanding a force of 700 men, utilized a superior concentration of long pikes, a tactical innovation funded by recent Seville credit lines, to break Almagro's veteran cavalry. This military engagement was fundamentally a dispute over the asset recovery of Cusco. Almagro, having returned from the failed Chilean expedition with a depleted treasury and a massive debt to the Panama syndicate, sought to seize the city to satisfy his creditors. Pizarro's victory was the mechanism by which Almagro's competing legal and financial claims were permanently extinguished. The aftermath of the battle initiated a period of debt restructuring through execution. The capture and subsequent garroting of Diego de Almagro in July 1538 allowed the Pizarro family to declare his Compañía shares forfeit, effectively absorbing his entire portfolio of encomiendas and mining rights. This consolidation of muscle ensured that the new Christian financiers no longer had to hedge their bets between two rival factions. They could now deal with a single, monopolistic entity. However, the violence at Las Salinas also triggered the first significant royal intervention, as the crown feared the Pizarros had become too autonomous from the civilian bourses. By 1539, the transition from a private joint stock venture to a centralized military governorship was complete, leaving the Almagrist remnants as toxic assets that would eventually trigger the assassination of Francisco Pizarro 3 years later. The execution of Diego de Almagro in July 1538 functioned as the definitive probate event for the Peruvian enterprise, triggering a massive redistribution of colonial assets. Under Spanish law, the death of a capitulación holder without a clear, royal-sanctioned heir allowed for the immediate dissolution of his estate. With the primary partner removed, the new Christian merchant houses in Panama and Seville bypassed the Pizarro family's military claims to initiate direct seizures of Almagro's land grants, or encomiendas. These financiers held prioritized liens in the form of unpaid provisioning contracts and maritime transport loans. To the bankers, Almagro's death was a necessary clearing of the ledger that permitted the conversion of disputed territory into seizable collateral. This liquidation was managed through the colonial notarial system, which the financier class had already penetrated. Creditors presented a backlog of debt certificates to the audiencia, demanding the transfer of Incan labor quotas to satisfy the principal and interest accrued during the Chilean campaign. This resulted in the corporate splintering of Almagro's new Toledo jurisdiction. Rather than remaining a unified administrative zone, the territory was carved into smaller, revenue-generating units that were granted to secondary investors to settle outstanding liabilities. By 1539, the physical assets of the Almagrist faction, including thousands of indigenous laborers and several silver-bearing veins, had been integrated into the global balance sheets of the Sephardic diaspora. This process ensured that while the conquistadors fought over the honor of the conquest, the merchant elite quietly secured the title to the land itself, turning the fallout of a civil war into a windfall for European capital. The 1545 discovery of the Cerro Rico at Potosi marked the transition from a loot-based asset seizure model to a permanent, industrial-scale revenue stream. Unlike the perishable ransom gold of Cajamarca, Potosi provided a geological infinite supply of silver, representing the ultimate exit strategy for the Sephardic financiers who had underwritten the initial conquest. The mountain's veins were so concentrated that they yielded over 40% silver per ton of ore. a ratio that fundamentally altered the global cost of capital. For the Converso merchant houses, this was the moment their speculative venture debt was converted into a self-sustaining, institutionalized equity that would dominate the global market for 2 centuries. The economic infrastructure of Potosi was managed through the META system, a state-enforced labor draft that the financier class optimized for maximum output. By leveraging their control over the supply of mercury from Almaden and Huancavelica, the Sephardic elite introduced the patio process, a cold mercury amalgamation technique that allowed for the extraction of silver from low-grade ores. This technological monopoly ensured that while the Spanish crown nominally owned the mines, the actual refining margin was captured by the private firms that supplied the chemical reagents and the heavy machinery. By 1550, the Cerro Rico was producing 60% of the world's silver, creating a steady, predictable flow of bullion that settled the legacy debts of the Pizarro-Almagro era. This transformed the Andes from a chaotic military frontier into the primary reserve bank for the European bourses, effectively de-risking the entire Peruvian investment for the generation to come. The actual control of the Peruvian silver industry was not determined at the mine face, but through the strategic monopoly of the mercury supply chain. Because Andean silver was often bound in low-grade sulfide ores, traditional smelting was thermally inefficient and economically unviable. The patio process, which utilized mercury amalgamation to chemically separate silver, became the mandatory industrial standard by 1570. This created a bottleneck economy where the Sephardic merchant houses, specifically those with deep ties to the Fugger banking family and the Almaden mines in Spain, could dictate the pace of global silver production. By controlling the quicksilver flow, these financiers effectively owned the on-off switch for the entire Spanish imperial economy. This monopoly was enforced through a series of exclusive asientos, or contracts, which granted Converso-linked firms the sole right to transport and distribute mercury across the Atlantic. These merchant syndicates managed the highly specialized logistics of moving volatile liquid metal in iron-bound sheepskin bags, a process requiring significant capital that the Spanish crown could not provide. Furthermore, the discovery of the Huancavelica mercury mine in Peru did not break this monopoly. Instead, the financier class integrated it into their existing network. They leveraged their letra de cambio system to provide the liquidity needed for the mine's complex ventilation and drainage projects. By 1572, the cost of silver production was artificially pegged to the price of mercury, ensuring that the new Christian elite captured the majority of the profit margin. This chemical monopoly turned the Spanish king into a tenant of his own mines, as he remained perpetually indebted to the providers of the one element essential for his solvency. By 1540, the transition from a mobile military campaign to a permanent colonial bureaucracy was facilitated by the professional New Christian class, who served as the primary architects and legal administrators of Lima. While the old Spanish aristocracy focused on land ownership, the Converso elite established the City of Kings as a centralized node for global trade and judicial regulation. These individuals utilized their literacy and deep knowledge of Roman law to draft the first municipal ordinances, effectively laundering the violent seizures of the Conquest into a legitimate, codified property system. By controlling the notarial offices and the audiencia clerks, they ensured that the paper trail of the new capital prioritized commercial interests and debt enforcement. The urban development of Lima was funded through the Portuguese pivot, with Sephardic merchants financing the construction of the port of Callao to create a direct maritime link between Andean silver and the Manila galleon trade. This class of urban merchants avoided the visibility of rural land grants, instead dominating the retail monopolies and the wholesale distribution of imported European luxury goods. They introduced the first sophisticated brokerage houses in the Americas, allowing for the internal clearing of silver before it ever reached the Royal Assay Office. By 1555, the city's economic life was managed by a network of converso physicians, lawyers, and chandlers who operated as the essential middleware of the empire. This professional hegemony allowed the diaspora to integrate into the highest levels of colonial society, using the complexity of the new legal and urban landscape to shield their capital from the Inquisition's scrutiny. The encomienda served as the primary financial instrument for the securitization of indigenous labor, functioning as a non-monetary dividend used to satisfy the original investors of the Peruvian conquest. Under this legal framework, the Spanish crown did not grant land ownership, but rather the right to extract tribute and labor from specific ethnic groups. To the Converso banking houses, these grants were viewed as high-yield annuities. Because the initial expeditionary debts were often denominated in bullion that the conquistadors did not yet possess, the transfer of encomienda rights became a standardized method for settling outstanding accounts with the dark pool financiers in Panama and Seville. This system transformed the Andean population into a liquid asset class. The value of an encomienda was calculated based on the taxable head count of the indigenous community, which determined the annual output of textiles, coca, and agricultural surplus. These commodities were then sold in urban markets like Lima to generate the hard currency required to service European loans. Furthermore, the encomenderos frequently utilized their labor grants as collateral for secondary credit lines, allowing them to purchase the mercury and iron necessary for silver refining. By 1548, the leyes nuevas attempted to curtail this practice, but the financier class successfully lobbied for the second life extension, ensuring that the debt of the conquest remained tied to human output for multiple generations. This forced labor economy ensured that even when mining yields fluctuated, the underlying labor interest remained a constant, predictable revenue stream for the Sephardic merchant elite. The establishment of the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Lima in 1570 represented a calculated shift from economic collaboration to state-sponsored expropriation. Once the logistical and financial infrastructure of the Viceroyalty of Peru was firmly institutionalized, the Spanish crown utilized religious purification as a legal mechanism to seize the assets of the new Christian class. This period was characterized by the tragic irony of the state turning against the same Sephardic financiers who had underwritten the initial expeditions and managed the mercury silver supply chain. Under the guise of prosecuting Judaizing heresies, the Inquisition functioned as an auxiliary treasury department, where the confiscation of property was the mandatory penalty for those convicted. The mechanics of the Inquisition provided a zero-cost method for the crown to cancel its outstanding debts. By arresting prominent merchants and bankers, the state could legally nullify the letra de cambio and loan agreements held by these individuals, effectively erasing centuries of accrued interest. The Edict of Faith served as a market disruption tool. Once an investigation began, the victim's credit was frozen, and their commercial partnerships were forcibly dissolved. This process targeted the middleware of the colonial economy, the physicians, lawyers, and international traders who provided the essential connectivity between Potosi and Europe. By 1580, the Inquisition had successfully purged the most influential Converso families from the administrative centers of Lima, allowing the crown to nationalize their private trade routes and consolidate the silver monopoly under direct imperial control, thereby completing the transition from a private venture capital model to an absolute command economy. The structural fallout of the 1538 settlement in Peru provided the architectural blueprint for the rise of Northern European joint stock corporations. As the Spanish Inquisition intensified, the disenfranchised Converso financial networks migrated their capital and logistical expertise to Amsterdam, where they integrated Andean venture models into the founding of the Dutch West India Company, WIC, in 1621. This was not merely a movement of people, but a porting of financial technologies. The system of fractionalized shares, dark pool provisioning, and secondary debt markets, originally prototyped by the Sephardic syndicates in Panama and Lima, became the standardized operating protocol for the Dutch Maritime Empire. Furthermore, the 1538 precedent of senior debt prioritization over royal tax claims evolved into the modern concept of the independent central bank. The realization that private merchant networks could control the primary industrial bottlenecks, such as the mercury trade, led to the development of sophisticated arbitrage and hedging instruments in the Amsterdam Bourse. This transition effectively decoupled global finance from the territorial sovereignty of any single monarch. By 1650, the Peruvian model of extracting resource wealth through a combination of global credit lines and state-enforced labor drafts had been perfected by the Dutch and English, forming the basis of the modern international banking system. The legacy of the Pizarro-Almagro era survives today in the structure of offshore finance and the institutionalization of debt as sovereignty, proving that the 16th century conquest of the Andes was the inaugural event of the globalized, capital-driven world order. The ultimate resolution of the 16th century Andean conquest was not found in a decisive military engagement, but in the final reconciliation of the banker's ledger. While traditional historiography emphasizes the tactical bravery of the Spanish infantry, the historical data suggests that the military outcome was a trailing indicator of financial solvency. The ghost in the gold refers to the invisible presence of the Sephardic merchant class within every ounce of bullion extracted from the Andes. By 1580, the individual conquistador had been reduced to a temporary agent of a much larger, stateless capital network. The soldier provided the physical force, but the banker provided the duration required to transform a chaotic invasion into a stable, revenue-producing territory. The transition from the sword to the account was completed when the Spanish crown became structurally dependent on the short-term credit provided by Converso-linked firms to sustain the very administration of Peru. This created a paradox where the victors of the conquest, such as the Pizarro and Almagro descendants, were largely impoverished or executed, while the silent partners in Europe successfully extracted the total net present value of the Inca Empire. The conquest was effectively a massive leveraged buyout, where the indigenous population and the Spanish soldiers were both collateralized assets. Ultimately, the ledger proved more durable than the steel. The military structures of the 1530s collapsed within a generation, but the debt-based governance and the global trade routes established by the diaspora became the permanent operating system of the modern world, proving that the pen of the notary was mightier than the lance of the knight. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.